A man stands before you and speaks a single sentence. I am lying. If he tells the truth, he lies. If he lies, he tells the truth. For more than 2 millennia, this simple statement has threatened the foundations of logic itself. This is the story of the liar paradox, a sentence that should not be possible but refuses to go away. We will follow it from ancient Greece through medieval monasteries and into the heart of 20th century mathematics, where it helped bring down the grandest intellectual project ever attempted. Along the way, we will meet the philosophers, logicians, and mathematicians who wrestled with a problem that seems trivial until you realize it might mean truth itself is broken. From Eubulides of Miletus in the 4th century before the Common Era to Kurt Gödel in 1931, from Stoic philosophers who wrote entire treatises now lost to Bertrand Russell, discovering that this ancient puzzle had been hiding inside mathematics all along, we will trace how a single self-destroying sentence became one of the most important problems in the history of human thought. The paradox appears almost innocent at first. Someone says I am lying, or in its cleaner modern form, this sentence is false. You begin to analyze it and immediately encounter something strange. If the sentence is true, then what it says must be the case, which means it is false. But if the sentence is false, then what it says is not the case, which means it must be true. True if false, false if true. The sentence flickers between contradictory states, never settling, never resolving. It is not a riddle with a clever answer. It is not wordplay that dissolves once you see the trick. It is something far more disturbing, a genuine contradiction that emerges from ordinary language following ordinary rules. Philosophy is full of puzzles that seem paradoxical until someone explains them properly, but the liar has resisted explanation for 23 centuries. Every generation of logicians has taken their turn. The Stoics, who prided themselves on their rigorous logic, became obsessed with it. Chrysippus of Soli, the third head of the Stoic school, wrote multiple treatises on the liar, none of which survive, but all of which apparently failed to solve it. Medieval scholars called it one of the insolubles, grouping it with other self-referential nightmares that threatened the coherence of theological reasoning. When Gottlob Frege built modern formal logic in the late 19th century, he thought he had finally created a system precise enough that ancient linguistic tangles could not touch it. Then Russell found the same paradox hiding in the foundations of set theory, and Frege's grand project collapsed. What makes the liar different from other philosophical problems is its absolute simplicity combined with its absolute resistance to solution. It requires no technical knowledge. A child can understand the paradox. Yet it has implications that reach into the deepest questions about truth, meaning, language, and the limits of formal systems. It connects to problems in mathematics, computer science, linguistics, and metaphysics. Gödel used a variant of it to prove that mathematics is incomplete. Tarski used it to show that truth cannot be defined within a language but only from outside. Contemporary philosophers still argue about whether the liar represents a failure of language, a limitation of classical logic, or perhaps even a truth that is both true and false simultaneously. The paradox forces a choice. Either we restrict language so that such sentences cannot be formed, or we abandon the principle that every statement must be either true or false, or we accept that some contradictions might be genuine. Each option carries profound consequences. Russell chose restriction, building an elaborate hierarchy of types that forbade self-reference at the cost of making mathematics artificial and cumbersome. Tarski chose hierarchy as well, creating infinite levels of truth predicates, each defined in a richer metal language than the one before. Others chose to question bivalence itself, developing logics where sentences can be neither true nor false, or where truth comes in degrees, or even logics that tolerate genuine contradictions without collapsing into incoherence. The liar also reveals something unsettling about self-reference. We use self-referential language constantly. This sentence contains 5 words, is self-referential and perfectly coherent. I am speaking English refers to itself without paradox. But change just a few words and you create something that seems to break the machinery of truth. Where is the boundary? What makes some self-reference safe and other self-reference paradoxical? These questions turn out to be extraordinarily difficult to answer precisely. Perhaps most remarkably, the liar demonstrates that ancient philosophy still matters in the most modern contexts. When computer scientists worry about programs that must reason about their own code, they encounter versions of the liar. When linguists study the semantics of natural language, they must account for how we manage to communicate despite the presence of potentially paradoxical constructions. When mathematicians probe the limits of formal systems, they find Gödel's theorem waiting, built on the skeleton of a paradox that Eubulides knew in the age of Aristotle. The problems that troubled the Stoics trouble us still, in new guises, but with the same fundamental structure. There is something almost alive about the liar paradox. It has survived every attempt to kill it. Dismiss it as mere wordplay, and it reappears in your axioms. Forbid the construction, and it finds another route to the same contradiction. Try to ignore it, and it quietly undermines the foundations of whatever system you are building. The history of the liar is the history of brilliant minds discovering that this thing they thought was trivial is actually fundamental, that this curiosity they thought was contained is actually everywhere, woven into the structure of logical thought itself. Before we can understand why this paradox matters so much, we need to go back to where it began, to the world of ancient Greece, where philosophers first discovered that language could turn against itself. We need to meet the man who may have spoken the first version of the liar, though the sentence attributed to him is not quite paradoxical in the way it seems. We need to understand the intellectual world in which such puzzles were not merely academic exercises but challenges to entire systems of thought, weapons in philosophical battles over the nature of truth and the reliability of reason. The story begins on the island of Crete, with a poet and prophet named Epimenides who said something about his fellow Cretans that would echo through millennia. Consider a man who says to you simply and clearly, "I am lying right now." You want to evaluate this claim. You want to determine whether it is true or false. This seems like it should be straightforward. Every meaningful sentence you have ever encountered falls into one category or the other. The sky is blue is true. The moon is made of cheese is false. You know how to assess claims about the world, but this sentence is different. Suppose the man tells the truth, then his statement accurately describes reality. But his statement claims that he is lying. So if he tells the truth, he must be lying. Already you feel the ground shifting. Now, suppose instead that he lies. Then his statement does not accurately describe reality. His statement claims he is lying. But if that claim is false, then he must be telling the truth. If he lies, he tells the truth. If he tells the truth, he lies. You might think you have made an error in reasoning. You retrace your steps. The logic seems airtight. Each inference follows necessarily from the previous one. Yet you arrive at an impossible conclusion, a sentence that is true if and only if it is false. This should not exist. In any coherent system of logic, a statement and its negation cannot both hold. Yet here stands this sentence, perfectly grammatical, seemingly meaningful, and utterly self-contradictory. This is the liar paradox. It appears simple, almost trivial. 5 words in English. This sentence is false. 13 letters in Greek. A child can understand the construction. Yet this sentence has troubled some of the greatest minds in human history, and it remains in important senses unsolved after more than 2,000 years. You might be tempted to dismiss it as wordplay. Language is full of ambiguities and tricks. Punts rely on double meanings. Riddles exploit unstated assumptions. Perhaps this is just another curiosity, amusing but ultimately unimportant. But the liar is not a riddle. A riddle has an answer that dissolves the puzzle once you see it. What has 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon and 3 in the evening? The answer is a human being moving through the stages of life. And once you know this, the riddle is explained. The puzzle vanishes. The liar does not vanish. Every proposed solution reveals new problems or simply relocates the paradox. Say that the sentence is meaningless rather than false. But why is it meaningless? It has clear grammatical structure. It uses words we understand. It seems to be about something, namely itself. If you claim it lacks meaning, you must explain what meaning is and why this particular construction fails to have it. That explanation will require a theory of meaning, and that theory will face its own challenges, often including new versions of the same paradox. Say instead that sentences cannot refer to themselves. This seems promising. Most sentences refer to things outside themselves. Snow is white refers to snow, not to the sentence about snow. Perhaps self-reference is the problem, and we should simply forbid it. But self-reference appears everywhere in ordinary language, and usually without contradiction. This sentence contains 5 words: is self-referential and true. This sentence is in English, is self-referential and true. This sentence is false, uses the same grammatical structure as these unproblematic cases. If you ban it, you must explain why this particular instance of self-reference creates paradox while others do not. You will need a principle that distinguishes legitimate from illegitimate self-reference. Finding such a principle has proven extraordinarily difficult. Perhaps the problem lies with the concept of truth itself. Perhaps truth is not the simple binary property we imagine. Perhaps sentences can be neither true nor false, or both true and false, or true to varying degrees. These proposals have been explored, and they lead into deep philosophical territory about the nature of truth, meaning, and reality. Each approach has defenders and costs. None has achieved consensus. The paradox survives, shifting shape but never disappearing. The stakes here are higher than they first appear. Logic is not an arbitrary game. It is the structure of rational thought, the framework within which we make inferences and evaluate arguments. Mathematics, science, philosophy, law, all depend on logical reasoning. We trust that if we start from true premises and reason correctly, we will arrive at true conclusions. We trust that contradictions signal error, a sentence that is both true and false, or neither true nor false, threatens this entire edifice. If the liar is genuinely possible, then truth itself may not be coherent. The foundations shake. You might wonder whether this is a problem with natural languages like English or Greek, languages that evolved for communication rather than logical precision. Perhaps in a properly constructed formal language, freed from the ambiguities of everyday speech, the paradox would not arise. This was the hope of many logicians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They built formal systems with explicit rules, systems where every symbol had precise meaning and every inference followed mechanical procedures. They believed they had left the liar behind in the messiness of natural language. They were wrong. The paradox reappeared inside mathematics itself, inside the formal systems designed to be perfectly rigorous. Bertrand Russell discovered a version of the liar hiding in set theory, the foundation of mathematics. His discovery showed that the paradox was not a linguistic accident, but a structural feature of logical systems that allow certain kinds of self-reference. You cannot simply build a better language and escape. The liar is more fundamental than that. Kurt Gödel would later use a sophisticated variant of the liar to prove that any formal system capable of expressing arithmetic must be either incomplete or inconsistent. His incompleteness theorems are among the most important results in the history of logic, and they rely essentially on paradoxical self-reference. The ancient puzzle about a Cretan who claims all Cretans are liars turns out to be connected to the deepest questions about the limits of formal proof and the nature of mathematical truth. What seemed like a parlor trick turns out to be a window into the structure of logical possibility itself. The paradox also reveals something about language and thought that we often overlook. We use language to describe the world, but language is also part of the world it describes. We think of words as transparent tools, means to talk about things outside language, but language can turn back on itself. It can make statements about statements, express propositions about propositions, refer to its own referring. Most of the time this capacity is harmless or even useful. Self-reference allows abstraction, allows us to talk about talking, think about thinking, reason about reasoning, but it also opens the door to constructions like the liar, sentences that trap themselves in contradiction. The history of the liar paradox is the history of repeated attempts to contain it, dismiss it, solve it, or explain it away, followed by repeated discoveries that the paradox is more resilient and more significant than anyone expected. Every generation of philosophers encounters it anew. Every generation believes at first that surely someone must have solved this by now. Every generation discovers that the solutions of the past have gaps or costs, that the paradox has depths not previously recognized. This persistence is itself remarkable. Ideas come and go, philosophical movements rise and fall, theories are proposed, refined, and replaced, but the liar remains, unchanged in its essential structure, waiting in the architecture of logic itself. It cannot be forgotten, because it emerges naturally from the most basic components of rational discourse: truth, negation, and self-reference. As long as we use these concepts, the paradox will be with us. Before we can understand why this paradox matters so much, we need to go back to where it began, to the world of ancient Greece, where philosophers first discovered that language could turn against itself. The island of Crete lies in the Mediterranean like a broken piece of a larger world, mountainous and strange, home to the ruins of a civilization already ancient when classical Greece began. Somewhere in the 6th century before the Common Era, a man named Epimenides lived there, a figure who blurs into legend almost the moment you try to examine him closely. He was said to be a prophet, a miracle worker, a poet. One version of his story claims he fell asleep in a cave as a young man and did not wake for 57 years. Another tradition says he lived to be 154 years old, or perhaps 299, or maybe he never died at all. The ancient world was comfortable with such contradictions. What matters for our purposes is not whether Epimenides was real, but what he supposedly said. According to various ancient sources, Epimenides made a pronouncement about his own people: all Cretans are liars. The statement appears in different forms across different texts, sometimes as poetry, sometimes as prose, always with the same essential structure. A Cretan declares that Cretans speak falsely. The Greeks found this amusing, the sort of clever twist that rhetoricians enjoyed. If you take the statement seriously, something odd happens. Epimenides is himself a Cretan. If all Cretans are liars, then Epimenides is a liar. If Epimenides is a liar, then his statement is false. If his statement is false, then it is not the case that all Cretans are liars, which means at least one Cretan tells the truth. Perhaps Epimenides himself is that truthful Cretan, but if he tells the truth, then all Cretans are indeed liars, which includes him, which means he lies, which means his statement is false, which means not all Cretans are liars, which means he might be telling the truth. The circle spins without resolution. Except it does not. Not quite. The Epimenides version is slippery. It gestures toward paradox but does not achieve it. The problem is the word all. If Epimenides declares that all Cretans are liars and he is himself a Cretan, his statement can simply be false without generating contradiction. He lies, therefore not all Cretans are liars. Therefore his lying does not prove his statement true. The loop breaks. You can dismiss the whole thing as a false universal claim. Some Cretans lie. Some tell the truth. Epimenides happens to be one of the liars, and we can all move on. The statement is paradoxical in flavor, strange in its self-reference, but not logically impossible. The Greeks understood this. They enjoyed the Epimenides puzzle, not because it was unsolvable, but because it was clever, a demonstration of how language could twist back on itself. Rhetoric in the ancient world was not merely persuasion, but also performance, a display of intellectual agility. To construct a statement that seemed to trap itself was amusing, worth repeating, worth preserving in texts for students to puzzle over. It belonged to the same tradition as riddles and sophistic tricks, the kind of thing you might encounter at a symposium after the wine had been flowing. It was not yet philosophy in the serious sense. The true paradox emerged later, sharpened and formalized, in the hands of a philosopher whose name has survived primarily because of this single contribution. Eubulides of Miletus lived in the 4th century before the Common Era, a contemporary of Aristotle, a member of the Megarian school of philosophy. The Megarians were followers of Euclid of Megara, not the geometer but a student of Socrates, and they specialized in logic and dialectic. They were known for being difficult, for constructing arguments that seemed airtight and led to absurd conclusions. Eubulides was apparently a master of this art. He is credited with several paradoxes, including the Sorites, which concerns how many grains of sand make a heap, and the horned man, which involves whether you have lost something you never had. But his most enduring creation was the lyre, stripped of Epimenides and Crete, and all particular content, reduced to its pure logical form. Imagine Eubulides standing before his students, presenting not a statement about a group of people but a single sentence about itself. I am lying, or in the form that became standard, this statement is false. No Cretans, no liars as a class, no ambiguity about scope or reference, just a sentence that declares its own falsehood. If the sentence is true, then what it says is the case, which means it is false. If the sentence is false, then what it says is not the case, which means it is not false, which means it is true. There is no escape through interpretation, no way to dismiss it as merely an incorrect universal claim. The sentence locks into place, each path leading to the other, neither stable. This was different from the Epimenides version, and the Greeks knew it. Eubulides had isolated something genuinely strange. The statement does not require any facts about the world, does not depend on who speaks it or when or where. It is purely structural, a piece of language that contradicts itself by its very form. You cannot solve it by gathering more information. You cannot solve it by being more careful about definitions. The problem is not in the details, but in the architecture. Greek philosophy in the 4th century before the Common Era was intensely concerned with logic and language. Plato had explored the relationship between words and things, between the ideal forms and their imperfect manifestations in speech. Aristotle was constructing a formal system of syllogistic logic, identifying valid and invalid forms of argument, creating the apparatus of terms and premises, and conclusions that would dominate Western logic for 2,000 years. The Megarians operated at the edge of this project, probing its boundaries, looking for places where the rules broke down or produced unexpected results. They were not vandals, but experimentalists, testing the limits of what rational discourse could accomplish. The liar paradox was initially treated as one of these experiments. It was called a pseudomonius, a deceiving or lying statement, and it was grouped with other logical puzzles that the Greeks called sophismata. These were arguments that seemed valid but led to false or absurd conclusions, or arguments whose validity was difficult to assess. The goal was not necessarily to solve them, but to understand what made them puzzling, to sharpen one's logical skills by grappling with difficult cases. Philosophy in this period was still partly oral, dialectical, a matter of argument and counter-argument in real time. A good paradox was a tool for training minds, for exposing hidden assumptions, for demonstrating the need for precision in thought and speech. Yet even in this early period, there was a sense that the liar was different from other puzzles. It was not merely difficult but unsettling. Most logical problems, no matter how tricky, could eventually be resolved by clarifying terms or identifying a hidden premise. The liar resisted this treatment. It sat there simple and clear and did something that seemed impossible. It made contradiction inescapable. You could not blame the paradox on vague language or confused thinking. The sentence was perfectly precise, and precision only made the problem worse. Ancient sources record debates about the pseudomonios, attempts to explain it away or diffuse it. Some argued that the sentence simply had no meaning, that it was a kind of nonsense dressed up as a statement. Others suggested that it was neither true nor false but something else, occupying some third category. Still others tried to identify exactly where in the chain of reasoning the mistake occurred, the hidden step where the argument went wrong. None of these approaches gained general acceptance. The paradox remained, passed from one generation of philosophers to the next, a curiosity but also a challenge. The Greeks recognized the paradox, but it was the Stoics who became obsessed with it. seeing in this strange sentence a challenge to their entire system of logic and their understanding of how language connects to the world. The Stoic school of philosophy approached the world with unusual confidence. Founded in Athens around 300 BCE by Zeno of Citium, the Stoics believed that the universe operated according to rational principles, that logic could capture the structure of reality, and that wisdom consisted in aligning your understanding with the way things truly are. Their system was comprehensive, ambitious, internally consistent. They developed formal logic, ethics, physics, and metaphysics all woven together into what they believed was an unassailable whole. Then they encountered a sentence that threatened to unravel everything. Chrysippus of Soli became the third head of the Stoic school around 230 BCE. By all accounts, he was a formidable intellect, credited with systematizing Stoic doctrine and defending it against critics from rival schools. Ancient sources claim he wrote more than 700 works, none of which survive intact. We know him now only through fragments, quotations by later philosophers, and references in texts that describe his arguments without preserving them. Among those 700 works, at least 9 were devoted entirely to the liar paradox, 9 complete treatises wrestling with a single self-contradicting sentence. This was not idle curiosity. For Chrysippus and his fellow Stoics, the paradox represented an existential threat. The Stoic logical system rested on a principle called bivalence. Every proposition is either true or false, with no third option. This was not a casual assumption, but a foundational commitment. If you believed that reason could guide you to wisdom, that the universe was rationally ordered, and that logic was the tool for understanding that order, then you needed truth to be stable, determinate, unambiguous. Every statement must land cleanly on one side or the other, true or false, no exceptions. The liar paradox did not fit. It seemed to be neither true nor false, or perhaps both, or perhaps something else entirely that their system had no room for. If a simple sentence could escape the categories that their entire philosophy depended on, what did that say about those categories? Chrysippus tried multiple strategies. One approach involved denying that the liar sentence actually made a claim at all. Perhaps when someone says, "I am lying," they produce sounds that resemble a proposition but fail to achieve meaningful reference. The sentence gestures at itself but cannot secure the semantic foothold needed to be genuinely true or false. This is more sophisticated than it might sound. It anticipates, by more than 2,000 years, modern theories about how sentences must satisfy certain conditions to count as truth-bearers. But even Chrysippus seemed to recognize the problem. The liar sentence does not feel meaningless. It has grammatical structure, clear terms, apparent content. If we can dismiss it as meaningless, why can we not dismiss any troublesome sentence the same way? Another strategy involved restricting self-reference. Perhaps the problem arises only when a sentence tries to describe its own truth value. If we simply forbid that move, the paradox disappears. But forbidding self-reference creates immediate difficulties. First, it is not clear how to enforce such a rule without making the logical system artificially constrained. Language naturally allows sentences to refer to themselves, directly or indirectly. Second, and more troubling, it is not obvious that self-reference alone causes the problem. You can construct paradoxes using multiple sentences that refer to each other in a circle, none referring to itself. Where do you draw the line? How much indirection is too much? Some later Stoics apparently considered abandoning bivalence itself. Perhaps some sentences are neither true nor false. Perhaps the liar is simply indeterminate, and we should expand our logical system to accommodate truth-value gaps. This is a radical move for a Stoic to contemplate. It means admitting that reality contains propositions that do not determinately correspond to facts, that truth is not as clean and binary as the system requires. It undermines the confidence that logic can capture the structure of the world without remainder. The Stoics who explored this option did so reluctantly, seeing it as a last resort rather than a satisfying solution. There is even evidence that some Stoics considered accepting inconsistency. Perhaps the liar sentence is both true and false, and we must learn to tolerate contradictions at the edges of our system. This approach would not gain serious traction for more than 2 millennia, but the fact that ancient philosophers considered it shows how desperate the situation felt. These were not careless thinkers stumbling into confusion. They were brilliant logicians staring at something that should not be possible and finding no way to make it go away. Ancient commentators noticed what was happening and found it darkly amusing. Diogenes Laertius, writing centuries later, records that Chrysippus was so obsessed with the paradox that critics joked he would have been better off never encountering it. Other philosophers mocked the Stoics for exhausting themselves on what seemed like a trivial puzzle, a rhetorical trick unworthy of serious attention. But the Stoics understood something their critics missed. This was not a parlor game. The liar revealed a genuine crack in the logical system they had built, and if they could not repair it, they could not trust anything else the system produced. What makes the Stoics' struggle particularly poignant is that they were almost certainly right to take the paradox seriously, even if they could not solve it. The questions the liar raises are not superficial. What makes a sentence true? How does language connect to reality? Can a sentence be about itself? What are the conditions under which words have meaning? These are not tangential concerns. They sit at the heart of any attempt to use logic as a tool for understanding the world. The Stoics built a system that required clear answers to these questions, and the liar showed that clear answers might not exist. Chrysippus died around 206 BCE, having spent much of his intellectual life grappling with the paradox. His 9 treatises are lost. We do not know whether he believed he had solved it, whether he died still searching, or whether he eventually concluded it was insoluble. The fragments that survive suggest he never stopped thinking about it, never dismissed it as unimportant, never pretended it was less threatening than it was. There is something admirable in that persistence, even if it proved futile. He saw a problem that undermined his worldview and refused to look away. The broader Stoic tradition continued after Chrysippus, and the liar continued to haunt it. Later Stoics proposed variations on his strategies, refinements, alternative approaches. None succeeded in making the paradox disappear. By the time Stoicism began to fade as a dominant philosophical school, the liar remained unsolved, a puzzle that brilliant minds had thrown themselves against without resolution. The paradox had proven stronger than the system built to contain it. What the Stoics discovered, though they could not fully articulate it, was that the liar paradox is not really about lying at all. It is about reference, meaning, and the strange loops that language can tie itself into when it tries to talk about its own properties. A sentence that says "I am lying" creates a circular structure where the truth of the sentence depends on whether the sentence is true, which depends on whether the sentence is true indefinitely. This circularity does not resolve, it does not stabilize, it spins without finding solid ground. The Stoics wanted logic to be a foundation, but here was a sentence that revealed the foundation itself resting on nothing. As Greek philosophy gave way to Christian theology, the liar paradox did not disappear. Instead, it found new life in a surprising place. The Bible itself, where St. Paul invokes the Cretan liar, embedding the paradox into sacred text. The letter arrives in Crete sometime around the year 63 of the Common Era. Its author, a former tent maker from Tarsus who now calls himself Paul, writes to a man named Titus about the proper governance of Christian communities on the island. Near the beginning of this epistle, Paul offers guidance about dealing with false teachers. He needs an example of the untrustworthiness of certain voices, and he reaches for a piece of local folklore. One of their own prophets, he writes, a man from Crete itself, has said that Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons. Paul adds his own judgment. This testimony is true. The reference is unmistakable to anyone educated in Greek philosophy. Paul has quoted Epimenides, and in doing so he has embedded the ancestral form of the liar paradox directly into what will become Christian scripture. For the early church, this passage presents no immediate problem. Paul's rhetorical purpose is clear enough. He wants to warn Titus about unreliable teachers, and he uses a well-known Greek saying to make his point. The logical structure underneath remains invisible, or at least unimportant, for several centuries. The Bible is read for moral instruction, for prophecy, for theology. It is not examined for logical consistency in the way a philosopher might dissect an argument in the academy. But by the late Roman period, as Christianity absorbs more and more of the classical intellectual tradition, the paradox begins to surface. Christian thinkers are trained in Aristotelian logic and Stoic philosophy. They read the Church Fathers alongside Plato. They cannot help but notice that the structure of Paul's citation is strange. If a Cretan says all Cretans are liars, and if this statement is true as Paul claims, then the Cretan who spoke it must be lying, which means not all Cretans are liars, which means the statement is false. But Paul has just said the testimony is true. This is not merely an embarrassing logical quirk. The stakes for a theologian are existential. Scripture is the word of God, dictated or inspired by divine truth. Every sentence in the Bible is supposed to be reliable, coherent, meaningful. If even one verse contains a paradox that cannot be resolved, what does that say about the nature of divine revelation? Can God speak contradictions? Can sacred text contain logical impossibility? The problem deepens when medieval scholars begin to collect and categorize these troublesome statements. They call them insolubles, from the Latin insolubilia, meaning unsolvable puzzles. The liar is the most famous, but it is not alone. There are sentences like "what I am now saying is false," or "no proposition is negative," or "every general rule has an exception." Each one twists back on itself. Each one refuses to settle into either truth or falsehood. And at least one of them sits in the New Testament, sanctified by inclusion in the Word of God. By the 14th century, insolubles have become a recognized field of philosophical inquiry. Treatises are written, debates are held, entire academic careers are devoted to wrestling with sentences that should not be possible. Two figures stand out for the sophistication and originality of their approaches: John Buridan and Thomas Bradwardine. Buridan, teaching at the University of Paris in the middle of the 14th century, produces a systematic analysis that tries to locate exactly where the liar goes wrong. He proposes that every statement carries with it an implicit claim about its own truth. When you say "it is raining," you are also implicitly asserting this statement is true. Most of the time, this implicit self-reference is harmless, invisible, but in the liar, the implicit becomes explicit, and the machinery jams. Buridan's solution is to deny that the liar successfully states anything at all. It looks like a sentence. It has the grammatical form of a proposition, but it fails to express a coherent thought. The liar is not false. In his view, it is not true either. It is meaningless, a string of words that only appears to make a claim. The problem is not with truth or logic, but with meaning itself. Some combinations of words, despite their grammatical correctness, do not manage to refer to anything in reality. The liar is one of those failures. This is a profound insight, and it anticipates much of what 20th century philosophers will eventually say about the paradox. Buridan recognizes that the issue is not simply about truth values, but about the conditions under which sentences mean something at all. A sentence can be grammatically well-formed and still fail to connect to the world in the way language requires. The liar exposes this gap between syntax and semantics, between the appearance of meaning and its substance. Thomas Bradwardine, working in England around the same time, takes a different approach. He agrees that insolubles involve self-reference, but he thinks the solution lies in being more careful about what each statement actually says. Bradwardine argues that when you make a statement, you are simultaneously asserting everything that logically follows from it. The liar, therefore, asserts not only its own falsehood, but also everything that follows from that assertion, including its own truth. This means the liar is internally contradictory, and any contradictory statement is simply false. Bradwardine's approach is more willing to assign a truth value to the liar. It is false, he says, but not for the reasons you might expect. It is false because it asserts too much, because it carries within itself both a claim and its negation. There is no paradox here, only a statement that violates the law of non-contradiction and thus must be rejected. Both Burden and Bradwardine are trying to protect the coherence of logic and language. Both recognize that the liar is a genuine threat, not a mere curiosity, and both develop sophisticated machinery to explain why the paradox arises and how it might be contained. Their treatises are dense, technical, filled with careful distinctions and formal arguments. These are not amateur philosophers amusing themselves with wordplay. They are serious logicians confronting a problem that seems to undermine the very possibility of rational discourse. The medieval discussion of insolubles reveals something else as well, the recognition that language is more fragile than it appears. For most of human history, words have been trusted as tools that connect mind to world, speaker to listener, thought to reality. But the liar shows that language can turn inward, that it can create structures which refer to themselves in ways that break the usual rules. Medieval philosophers do not have the formal apparatus of modern logic, but they understand intuitively that self-reference is dangerous, that circularity threatens to collapse meaning into nonsense. There is something else worth noticing. The medieval engagement with the liar is not abstract or detached. These philosophers care deeply about the outcome because they believe truth matters, because they think language is a gift that allows human beings to approach the divine. If sentences can contradict themselves, if scripture can contain paradox, then the entire edifice of theology is at risk. The insolubles are not just intellectual puzzles, they are spiritual crises. By the end of the 14th century, the liar has been thoroughly examined, categorized, argued over, and provisionally contained. The solutions offered by Burden and Bradwardine do not satisfy everyone, but they provide frameworks for thinking about the problem. The paradox is acknowledged, respected, and carefully set aside. It remains in the textbooks as a known difficulty, a challenge for advanced students, a reminder that language has limits. For centuries, the liar remained a theological and philosophical curiosity, important but contained. Then came the 19th century and a revolution in logic that would transform the paradox from a puzzle into a crisis. In 1879, a German mathematician named Gottlob Frege published a slim volume with an intimidating title, Begriffsschrift, which translates roughly as concept script or notation for concepts. The book was fewer than 90 pages long, dense with strange symbols that looked nothing like ordinary mathematical notation. Most mathematicians ignored it. Those who bothered to look found the symbolism arcane, the prose difficult, the purpose unclear. But Begriffsschrift was not simply another mathematics text. It was the birth certificate of modern logic, the moment when the ancient art of reasoning transformed into a precise mechanical science. Frege had invented something unprecedented, a formal language capable of expressing any logical relationship with perfect clarity and rigor. Where Aristotle had catalogued valid argument forms in natural language, and medieval logicians had refined these patterns through centuries of scholastic debate, Frege created a notation so exact that ambiguity became impossible. Every inference, every connection between propositions, every step of reasoning could be written down in symbols whose meaning was fixed and whose manipulation followed explicit rules. Logic became mathematics. Or perhaps more accurately, Frege showed that mathematics had been logic all along, if only we had eyes to see it. Consider what Frege accomplished. He developed a system of quantifiers that could express statements like all, some, and none with absolute precision. He distinguished between objects and concepts, between names and predicates, between saying something is true and saying what makes it true. He showed how complex statements could be built from simple ones using logical connectives whose behavior was perfectly defined. Most radically, he demonstrated that arithmetic itself could be derived from pure logic, that numbers were not mysterious entities requiring special intuition, but logical constructions that emerged inevitably from the structure of thought itself. This was the logicist program, and it represented nothing less than the dream of certain knowledge. If mathematics could be reduced to logic, and if logic could be formalized into a system of mechanical rules, then mathematical truth would rest on foundations more secure than anything humanity had ever possessed. No appeals to intuition, no reliance on physical diagrams, no trust in the uncertain testimony of the senses, just pure reason, pure form, pure necessity. A mathematical theorem would be true not because we perceived it to be true, not because it described some feature of the physical world, but because it followed inevitably from logical axioms whose truth was self-evident and undeniable. The implications were staggering. For millennia, philosophers had asked what we could know with certainty. Plato had placed true knowledge in a realm of eternal forms beyond the deceptive flux of experience. Descartes had sought indubitable foundations in the fact of his own thinking. Kant had argued that mathematical knowledge rested on pure intuitions of space and time built into the structure of the mind itself. Now Frege offered something more radical. Mathematical truth required nothing beyond logic, and logic required nothing beyond the laws of thought that any rational being must accept. Mathematics was not about the world at all. It was about what must be true in any possible world where thought occurs. The optimism of late 19th century mathematics made Frege's vision seem not just plausible, but inevitable. Mathematics was experiencing a golden age of rigor and expansion. Kolchi and Weierstrass had placed calculus on firm foundations, eliminating the vague infinitesimals that had troubled Newton and Leibniz. Dedekind and Cantor had constructed the real numbers from rational numbers, the rational numbers from integers, reducing the continuous to the discrete. Everywhere mathematicians looked, they found their subject becoming more precise, more general, more secure. The wild frontiers were being mapped, the intuitive made rigorous, the mysterious made clear. Mathematicians began to believe they were approaching a final theory of their own discipline, not simply new theorems and new techniques, but a complete understanding of what mathematics was, what made it true, and why it worked. The foundations would be secured once and for all. Every theorem would trace back through a finite chain of logical steps to axioms so simple and obvious that doubt would be impossible. Mathematics would become a closed system, perfect and complete, a monument to human reason that would stand forever. In this atmosphere, the ancient paradoxes seemed like embarrassments from a less sophisticated age. The lyre belonged to natural language with its ambiguities, its context dependencies, its endless opportunities for confusion. Formal logic would have none of that. Every symbol would have exactly one meaning. Every operation would follow precise rules. Self-reference, that murky business of statements folding back upon themselves, would be exposed as a trick of informal reasoning with no place in a properly constructed logical system. The paradoxes were linguistic accidents, artifacts of our imprecise ways of speaking, destined to dissolve once we replaced ordinary language with something better. Frege himself paid little attention to the lyre. It was not his concern. He was building something positive, something grand, a complete logical foundation for arithmetic, and through arithmetic, for all of mathematics. In his 2-volume work The Basic Laws of Arithmetic, published in 1893 and 1903, he laid out his system in exhaustive detail. He showed how to define numbers in logical terms, how to prove the basic laws of arithmetic from logical axioms, how to extend the system to encompass more and more mathematics. Volume by volume, theorem by theorem, the edifice rose. His notation remained difficult, his prose austere, his readership small. But those who understood what Frege was doing recognized the ambition and the achievement. Here was the answer to thousands of years of philosophical uncertainty about mathematical knowledge. Here was proof that reason alone, properly formalized, could generate absolute truth. The logicist program was not simply solving a technical problem about foundations. It was demonstrating the power of pure thought to reach certainty without appealing to anything outside itself. Yet there was something almost too perfect about Frege's system, something that made it feel inevitable that a flaw would appear. The architecture was so elegant, so complete, so ambitious in its claims. Frege had taken the most abstract and certain part of human knowledge and shown it rested on nothing but logic itself. He had made mathematics invulnerable to skepticism, secured it against any possible doubt. The dream was so beautiful, the vision so compelling, that perhaps we should have suspected the universe would not permit such total victory. The symbols Frege invented would outlive his system. Modern logic still uses descendants of his notation, still builds on his insights about quantification and predication and logical structure, but the specific logical edifice he constructed, the particular axioms he thought would serve as foundations for all mathematical truth, would not survive. Something was hiding in those axioms, something Frege had not noticed, something that would turn his perfect system into an elegant contradiction. For 6 years after the publication of his first volume of the Basic Laws of Arithmetic, Frege's logical foundation stood unchallenged. The second volume appeared in 1903. The project seemed complete, or nearly so, and then a young British philosopher wrote Frege a letter that would change everything. Frege's logical system appeared flawless, a foundation upon which all mathematical truth could be built. Then, in 1901, Bertrand Russell discovered something that would shatter that dream completely. Bertrand Russell was 29 years old in the summer of 1901, already recognized as a brilliant mathematician and philosopher, when he discovered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was working on what would become Principia Mathematica, attempting to complete the program Frege had begun, deriving all of mathematics from pure logic. The work required him to think carefully about sets, those fundamental collections that seem to underlie all mathematical objects. A set of numbers, a set of points, a set of functions. Everything in mathematics, Russell believed, could be understood as sets or operations on sets. Then he asked himself a question that seemed innocent enough. Some sets are members of themselves. The set of all sets, for instance, must contain itself, since it is itself a set. The set of all abstract concepts is itself an abstract concept, but most sets do not contain themselves. The set of all apples is not itself an apple. The set of all numbers is not itself a number. This seemed like a natural distinction, the kind of careful categorization that mathematics required. So Russell considered the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Call it R. Now ask, does R contain itself? If R contains itself, then by definition it must be a set that does not contain itself. Contradiction. If R does not contain itself, then it meets the criterion for membership in R, which means it must contain itself. Contradiction again. No matter which path you choose, you arrive at impossibility. Russell recognized immediately what he had found. This was not a quirk of his particular formulation. This was not a problem that better definitions might resolve. This was the liar paradox, translated perfectly into the language of set theory. The set R was saying about itself exactly what the Cretan said about his own statement. I am not what I claim to be. And just as the liar sentence produces contradiction whether you assume it true or false, Russell's set produces contradiction whether you assume it contains itself or not. The structure was identical. Both paradoxes arise from self-reference. Both involve a statement or object that attempts to categorize or describe itself. Both generate contradiction through a kind of logical recursion, where each answer produces its own negation. The ancient Greeks had discovered this pattern in language. Russell had discovered it hiding in the foundations of mathematics itself, in the very concept of a set. But there was something worse here, something that went beyond the philosophical puzzles that had entertained and frustrated thinkers for 2 millennia. Frege had built his entire logical system on the assumption that for any coherent property, there exists a set of all things with that property. The property of being a set that does not contain itself seemed perfectly coherent. But Russell had just proved that the corresponding set could not exist without contradiction. If Frege's basic axiom allowed the construction of contradictory sets, then every theorem derived from that axiom was suspect. The whole magnificent edifice was unsound. Russell wrote to Frege in June of 1902. The letter was polite, almost apologetic. Russell expressed admiration for Frege's work, acknowledged its importance, and then, with careful precision, explained the contradiction. He presented it not as a refutation, but as a puzzle he hoped Frege might solve. Perhaps there was some restriction Russell had overlooked, some subtle distinction that would dissolve the paradox. Frege's reply arrived quickly. He acknowledged the problem immediately and completely. Your discovery of the contradiction caused me the greatest surprise, and I would almost say consternation, since it has shaken the basis on which I intended to build arithmetic. There was no defensiveness in the response, no attempt to minimize the damage. Frege saw at once what Russell had found. The second volume of his Grundgesetze der Arithmetik was already in press. He added a hasty appendix acknowledging the contradiction, proposing a modification to his axioms, but admitting he did not know if the modification would work or merely relocate the problem. It did not work. The modification failed. Frege's system could not be salvaged. He spent years attempting repairs, exploring alternatives, but nothing succeeded. Eventually, he abandoned the project entirely. In his final years, Frege would write that his life's work had been a failure, that the foundation he had tried to build for mathematics had collapsed beneath him. A single paradox, the same pattern discovered by Greek rhetoricians more than 2,000 years earlier, had brought down the most rigorous logical system ever constructed. What Russell had discovered was that the liar paradox was not merely a problem of natural language, not merely a puzzle about truth and meaning in everyday speech. It was a structural feature of any system rich enough to allow self-reference. You could translate it into set theory. You could presumably translate it into any formal language capable of expressing statements about its own statements. The paradox was not a bug in how humans happened to speak. It was a fundamental instability in the architecture of reference itself. This realization marked a profound shift in how logicians understood their task. Before Russell, paradoxes like the liar could be dismissed as artifacts of imprecise natural language. Mathematics was supposed to be different, pure, immune to such confusions. Frege's formal logic was designed specifically to eliminate ambiguity, to make reasoning so clear and explicit that contradiction would be impossible. Yet the moment you allowed sets to be members of other sets, the moment you permitted self-reference within the system, the ancient paradox returned in perfect formal dress. The difference between the liar in natural language and Russell's paradox in set theory was not one of kind but of consequence. When a sentence in English generates contradiction, we can shrug and note that language is messy, that meaning is context-dependent, that perhaps some sentences simply fail to express propositions. When a formal system generates contradiction, the entire system becomes useless. In classical logic, from a contradiction, anything follows. If you can prove both that something is true and that it is false, you can prove every statement within your system. Mathematics collapses into incoherence. Russell had shown that you could not build mathematics on naive set theory. You could not simply assume that every property determines a set. Self-reference had to be controlled, restricted, somehow forbidden. The liar had been lurking inside Frege's beautiful logical notation all along, waiting in the shadows of self-membership and definition by exclusion. It had taken someone working through the details, someone thinking carefully about what sets could and could not do, to find where the ancient sentence had hidden itself. For Russell, this discovery marked the beginning of a long struggle. He could not simply walk away from the problem. Mathematics needed foundations, and if naive set theory failed, something else had to take its place. The paradox was now his responsibility. He would spend the next decade searching for a way to preserve Frege's insights while eliminating the contradictions, trying to build a system where self-reference could never occur, where sets would be organized into strict hierarchies that prevented any collection from containing or excluding itself. Russell could not ignore what he had found. For the next decade, he and Alfred North Whitehead would labor to build a new logical system, one that could cage the paradox and make mathematics safe again. Between 1901, when Bertrand Russell first discovered his paradox, and 1910, when the first volume of Principia Mathematica appeared, nearly a decade passed. Russell did not spend those years in quiet contemplation. He spent them constructing what might be the most ambitious logical edifice ever attempted by human minds, a system so comprehensive and so rigorous that paradox itself would have nowhere to hide. The paradox had emerged from language turning back on itself, from sentences that spoke about their own truth. Russell's solution was deceptively simple in concept, brutally difficult in execution. Build a hierarchy so strict that nothing could ever refer to itself. Forbid the very moves that make paradox possible. The theory of types begins with a division. At the lowest level sit objects, individual things in the world. At the next level sit properties of those objects, predicates that describe them. Above that sit properties of properties, and above that properties of properties of properties, ascending into an infinite hierarchy of logical types. Each level can speak only about the levels below it, never about itself, never about anything above. A statement about objects belongs to one type. A statement about statements about objects belongs to a higher type. The boundaries are absolute. Why such strictness? Because the liar paradox and Russell's own set theoretic version both depend on a kind of circularity that crosses these boundaries. When you say this sentence is false, you are attempting something that the theory of types declares meaningless, making a statement at one level that refers to itself at the same level. In Russell's system, any predicate like is false must apply only to statements at a lower level than itself. There is no is false that can reach back to touch the very statement that contains it. The sentence "this sentence is false" becomes not paradoxical but nonsensical, a violation of type, a grammatical impossibility in the formal language. You can see the elegance. The paradox exists because language is too flexible, because ordinary grammar permits constructions that logic cannot tolerate. The theory of types imposes discipline. It says certain combinations of words, no matter how grammatical they appear in English or Greek, simply cannot be translated into proper logical form. They are pseudo-statements, arrangements of symbols that look like they mean something but actually fail to express any proposition at all. But you can also see the cost. Mathematics, which had seemed a unified field, splinters into levels. The concept of truth fractures. There is truth for statements about objects, and a different notion of truth for statements about those statements, and another for statements about those. You cannot have a single universal truth predicate. Every time you want to talk about truth, you must specify which level of truth you mean. The natural unity of mathematical language disappears, replaced by an architecture of infinite floors with no elevator between them. Russell collaborated with Alfred North Whitehead, a mathematician whose interests range from geometry to metaphysics, and together they set out to demonstrate that their system could support all of mathematics. The result was Principia Mathematica, published in 3 volumes between 1910 and 1913. To call these books monumental fails to capture their strange combination of ambition and tedium. Volume 1 begins with hundreds of pages establishing basic logical notation and proving elementary results. It takes until page 362 to prove that 1 + 1 = 2, a theorem marked with a note of triumph. The above proposition is occasionally useful. The humor there is real, but so is the exhaustion behind it. Russell and Whitehead were attempting something no one had tried before, deriving the entirety of mathematics from pure logic, with every step justified, every assumption explicit, every potential paradox guarded against by the rigid hierarchy of types. They succeeded in their construction. The system works. Within its framework you can derive arithmetic, build up to real numbers, construct analysis. The paradoxes cannot form because the syntax itself prevents the necessary self-reference. Yet even as the volumes appeared, responses were mixed. Some mathematicians praised the rigor. Others found the whole enterprise bizarre. Mathematics, as actually practiced, did not feel like this. Mathematicians spoke about numbers, about sets, about functions without constantly tracking which logical type each statement belonged to. They used self-reference all the time without falling into paradox. Definitions that referred to the totality of objects they were defining, so-called impredicative definitions, appeared throughout classical mathematics and seemed to cause no problems. The theory of types banned these definitions as meaningless, which meant declaring meaningless certain proofs that every mathematician accepted. There was also something aesthetically unsatisfying about the solution. The theory of types prevents paradox by fiat, by declaration. It does not explain what goes wrong in the liar sentence. It does not illuminate the paradox. It simply makes it impossible to formulate by imposing syntactic restrictions. You might wonder whether this approach is philosophy or mere legislation. The paradox revealed something strange about self-reference and truth. Russell's response amounts to saying, very well, we shall not permit self-reference. Problem solved. But is the problem solved, or merely evaded? The liar paradox exists in natural language, which has no such restrictions. People say this sentence is false without their words becoming meaningless. The sentence seems to mean something, seems to create genuine logical trouble. The theory of types responds by constructing an artificial language in which that sentence cannot be formed. This leaves a gap between formal logic and the language humans actually use, a gap that contains the paradox, still unexplained. Russell himself seemed aware of the limitations. In his introduction to the Principia, he distinguished between simple type theory, which handles most paradoxes, and ramified type theory, a more complex system needed to close remaining loopholes. The ramifications multiply the levels further, creating hierarchies within hierarchies. The system grows increasingly intricate, increasingly distant from mathematical practice. Later logicians would find ways to simplify some of these complexities, but the fundamental trade remained, safety purchased at the price of naturalness. The philosophical questions linger. The theory of types treats certain sentences as meaningless, but they do not feel meaningless when you encounter them in ordinary language. They feel paradoxical, which is different. A meaningless sentence is like colorless green ideas sleep furiously, grammatical but empty. The liar is not empty. It seems to say something, to make a claim, even if that claim tangles itself into contradiction. By declaring such sentences mere nonsense, Russell may have protected formal logic, but he left the philosophical problem untouched. And there is something almost sad about the image of Russell and Whitehead laboring for years to produce these volumes, proving elementary arithmetic with hundreds of pages of symbolic machinery, only to watch mathematics continue largely as before. The Principia demonstrated that mathematics could be founded on logic, at least within their system, but it did not demonstrate that this was how mathematics should be founded, or that the edifice they built was anything more than a logical possibility. Most mathematicians never learned the notation. The volumes stood as monuments to what could be done, if you were willing to pay the price in complexity and artificiality. Still, the achievement remains remarkable. Russell and Whitehead took the paradox seriously enough to rebuild logic from the ground up. They showed that consistency is possible, that you can construct a system in which the paradoxes have no home. Even if their solution feels like quarantining the problem rather than curing it, the quarantine works. Within the theory of types, mathematics proceeds without contradiction. The question is whether the walls Russell built were walls around the paradox, or walls around ourselves. By forbidding self-reference, we protect our logical systems, but we also cut ourselves off from something, some flexibility or expressiveness that natural language possesses. The theory of types suggests that human language might be dangerously powerful, capable of forming thoughts that appear meaningful, but actually exceed what logic can support. Russell had contained the paradox by forbidding the very kind of self-reference that creates it, but a young Austrian logician was about to prove that self-reference cannot be eliminated, and in doing so, he would use a version of the liar to demonstrate that mathematics itself is fundamentally incomplete. Kurt Gödel was 25 years old when he destroyed the dream of mathematical certainty. In 1931, working in Vienna as a recently minted doctor of philosophy, he published a paper with the modest title on formally undecidable propositions of Principia Mathematica and related systems. The content was anything but modest. In fewer than 30 pages of dense symbolic logic, Gödel proved that mathematics could never be complete, never be self-contained, never provide the absolute foundation that Hilbert and Russell and generations of mathematicians had sought. The weapon he used was a transformed version of the liar paradox, rendered harmless to logic but devastating to the ambitions of those who believed human reason could build a perfect system. The question Gödel asked was deceptively simple. Given a formal system of mathematics, a set of axioms and rules of inference like those Russell and Whitehead had constructed, could that system prove every true statement expressible in its language? Or to put it another way, was mathematics complete? Could everything true be proven true, everything false be proven false within a single consistent framework? The logicists had assumed the answer must be yes. A complete formal system was precisely what Principia Mathematica had attempted to provide, but Gödel saw something they had missed. He saw that if you could make a mathematical system talk about itself, if you could encode statements about probability within the language of mathematics itself, then you could construct a sentence that would break the system open from within. The trick was finding a way to let mathematics refer to its own statements and proofs without using words like statement or proof. Mathematics deals in numbers and operations, not in sentences and truth. Gödel's insight was to assign numbers to logical symbols, formulas, and proofs themselves. Every statement in a formal system could be translated into a unique number. Every proof became a sequence of numbers. Through this coding scheme, arithmetic statements could secretly be statements about other arithmetic statements. This technique, now called Gödel numbering, was extraordinarily clever. Take a simple formula like 2 plus 2 equals 4. Assign a unique number to each symbol. The numeral 2 gets one number, the plus sign another, the equals sign a third. String these numbers together using prime number exponentiation, and the entire formula becomes a single gigantic number that encodes its structure completely. You can reverse the process, take the number, factor it, and recover the original formula. Every possible mathematical statement has a Gödel number. Every possible proof is a number. The entire landscape of mathematical reasoning becomes a subset of arithmetic. Now comes the paradox. If proofs are numbers, then being provable is a property that numbers can have. Some numbers encode provable statements, others do not. With sufficient cleverness, you can write an arithmetic formula that effectively says the statement with Gödel number n is not provable in this system. This is a perfectly legitimate arithmetic statement. It talks about divisibility, prime factors, numerical relationships, but it means something about provability. Gödel constructed a statement that asserted its own unprovability. Call this statement G. If you decode what G says in plain language, it declares, this statement is not provable. You recognize the structure. This is the liar paradox in mathematical clothing, but Gödel made one crucial modification. The liar says, I am false. The Gödel sentence says, I am not provable. Truth and probability are not the same thing, and that difference changes everything. Consider what happens if G were provable. Then the system proves a statement that says it cannot be proved. The system proves something false. The system is inconsistent, but Gödel assumed we are working with a consistent system, one that does not prove falsehoods. Therefore G cannot be provable. Now consider what happens if G is false. If G is false, then its negation is true, which means G is provable. But we just established that G cannot be provable in a consistent system. Contradiction. Therefore G cannot be false. G must be true. It accurately declares its own unprovability. But if G is true and unprovable, then we have found a true mathematical statement that the system cannot prove. The system is incomplete. There are truths it cannot reach. This was the first incompleteness theorem. Any formal system powerful enough to express basic arithmetic must be either incomplete or inconsistent. If it is consistent, it must be incomplete. There will always be true statements that slip through the net of provability. The second incompleteness theorem followed from the first with almost casual brutality. Gödel showed that no consistent formal system can prove its own consistency. The very property that mathematics needs to be trustworthy, freedom from contradiction, cannot be established from within. You must step outside the system, adopt a higher perspective, use stronger assumptions. But then those stronger assumptions cannot prove themselves consistent either. The hierarchy extends forever. The mathematical community reacted slowly at first. Gödel presented his results at a conference in Königsberg in September 1930, but few in the audience grasped the implications immediately. John von Neumann, perhaps the quickest mind in the room, understood within days. He wrote to Gödel describing the second incompleteness theorem, only to discover that Gödel had already proved it himself. Von Neumann abandoned his own work on the proof and freely acknowledged Gödel's priority. When the paper appeared in print in 1931, the shockwaves began to spread. For Russell, the news was devastating. He had spent a decade building Principia Mathematica as a fortress against paradox. He had banned self-reference, erected his theory of types, accepted a cumbersome formalism as the price of certainty, and now this young logician had shown that self-reference could not be eliminated, that it lived in the heart of arithmetic itself, and that the price of consistency was permanent incompleteness. Everything true could not be proven. The dream of reducing all mathematics to a finite set of logical axioms was dead. Hilbert took the blow with more defiance. His response to Gödel was to push forward with his program anyway, seeking to prove consistency through finitary methods, even if completeness was lost. But the second incompleteness theorem had cut off even this retreat. Consistency could not be proven from within. The foundations remained uncertain. What made Gödel's achievement so remarkable was not just the result, but the method. He had taken the liar paradox, the ancient curse that threatened to destroy logic, and had domesticated it. By replacing false with not provable, he avoided contradiction while preserving the self-referential structure that gives the paradox its power. The liar destroys itself by being both true and false. The Gödel sentence survives by being true but unprovable. It is a paradox that knows how to behave, a self-referential statement that illuminates rather than obliterates. The philosophical implications reached far beyond mathematics. If formal systems cannot capture all truth, then truth is larger than proof. If consistency cannot be demonstrated from within, then certainty requires faith in something outside the system. The vision of mathematics as an autonomous, self-justifying structure collapsed. Human reason could build magnificent edifices of logic, but those edifices would always stand on foundations they could not verify, would always contain truths they could not reach. The liar paradox had been, for more than 2,000 years, a problem to be solved or avoided. Gödel showed it was a tool, a lens through which the limits of formal systems become visible. Self-reference was not a disease to be cured, but a window into the structure of mathematical truth. The sentence that destroys itself had a gentler cousin that revealed incompleteness without causing collapse. Yet, even as Gödel neutralized one version of the paradox, the original liar remained untouched. This sentence is false still generated contradiction. Truth still behaved differently than provability. The question of how language could contain such a sentence, what theory of meaning could accommodate it, persisted. Gödel had shown what self-reference could reveal about formal systems. He had not explained how self-reference was possible, why language permitted it, or what it meant for the nature of truth itself. Gödel showed that the liar, properly handled, reveals fundamental limits to formal systems, but the paradox itself remained unsolved. Could we at least build a coherent theory of truth that explains why the liar fails? Gödel had shown that self-reference cannot be banished from mathematics. Russell's elaborate hierarchies of types could postpone the paradox, delay its appearance, force it to speak in more complicated sentences, but they could not make it disappear. The liar remained, lurking in the structure of any sufficiently rich formal system. Yet one question still hung unanswered. Could we at least explain why the liar fails? Could we build a rigorous theory that tells us what truth is, and in doing so, reveal precisely where the paradoxical sentence goes wrong? Alfred Tarski believed he could. In 1933, working in Warsaw while Europe descended toward catastrophe, this Polish logician published a paper that would transform how philosophers understand the concept of truth itself. The work appeared in Polish first, then in German translation, under a title that promised exactly what generations had sought: the concept of truth in formalized languages. What Tarski offered was not another attempt to solve the liar by restricting logic or accepting contradiction. Instead, he proposed something more radical, a demonstration that the very idea of defining truth within a single language is incoherent. The liar does not reveal a flaw in our logical systems. It reveals an impossibility built into the nature of truth itself. Tarski began with a deceptively simple observation. When we say a sentence is true, we are making a claim about that sentence. The sentence itself exists at one level, and our claim about its truth exists at another. Consider the sentence "snow is white." This is a statement about snow. Now consider the sentence "snow is white" is true. This is a statement about a statement. These operate at different logical levels, even though we use the same language to express both. Tarski formalized this intuition through a distinction that would become foundational. He called the language we are talking about the object language. He called the language we use to talk about the object language the meta language. The object language contains sentences about the world, about numbers, about whatever domain we care to describe. The meta language contains sentences about those sentences, including claims about which object language sentences are true and which are false. The crucial insight comes next. Tarski proved that for any formal language EL, the truth predicate for L cannot be defined within L itself. You cannot use the resources of a language to completely characterize what it means for sentences in that same language to be true. Truth for L requires a meta language, a richer system with additional expressive power. The meta language must be able to talk about all the sentences of L, to name them, to describe their structure, and only then can it define what truth means for those sentences. Why must this be so? Tarski's proof is technically complex, but the intuition connects directly to the liar. Suppose you could define truth for a language L within L itself. Suppose L contained its own truth predicate. Then L could form sentences that refer to themselves using that truth predicate. It could construct this sentence is not true in L, and now you have rebuilt the liar paradox inside your formal system. The contradiction returns. The only way to avoid it is to deny the assumption truth for L cannot be defined in L. This creates what Tarski called the hierarchy of languages. To talk about truth in your object language, you need a meta language, but that meta language is itself a language, and to talk about truth in the meta language, you need a meta-meta language. The hierarchy ascends infinitely. At each level you can define truth for the level below, but never for your own level. Truth fragments into an infinite series of truth predicates, each applying to sentences at a lower level of the hierarchy. The elegance of this solution is mathematical. Tarski had not hand-waved or appealed to intuitions about meaning. He had proven, with rigorous formality, exactly where and why the liar fails. The liar attempts to apply a truth predicate to a sentence at the same level as that predicate. It tries to make a language talk about its own truth, which Tarski showed to be impossible. The liar is not a genuine sentence that happens to generate contradiction. It is a pseudo-sentence, a string of symbols that looks grammatical, but actually attempts something that formal semantics cannot permit. Tarski's theory also provided what philosophers had sought since Aristotle: a rigorous definition of truth. His convention T states that any adequate definition must yield, for every sentence in the object language, a corresponding sentence in the meta language of the form S is true if and only if P, where S is a name for the sentence, and P is that sentence itself or its translation into the meta language. The classic example, "snow is white," is true if and only if snow is white. This captures the intuition that truth is correspondence between language and reality, but it does so without paradox because the truth predicate lives in the meta language, while the claim about snow lives in the object language. For formal languages, for the precise symbolic systems that logicians and mathematicians work with, Tarski's theory was a triumph. It explained truth. It explained why the liar fails. It showed how to build consistent theories without running into self-referential contradiction. The paper was dense, technical, brilliant. It established Tarski as one of the giants of 20th century logic. But something felt incomplete. Tarski himself acknowledged that his theory applied cleanly only to formalized languages, artificial systems with precisely defined syntax and semantics. Natural languages like English or Polish presented a different problem. We do say things like, "This sentence is false" in ordinary speech. We do seem to have a single truth predicate that we apply at all levels without carefully distinguishing object language from meta language. Either natural languages are inconsistent, capable of generating genuine contradictions, or they work in some way that Tarski's hierarchy cannot fully capture. Tarski leaned toward the first option. He suggested that natural languages might indeed be inherently inconsistent, that the price of their flexibility and expressiveness is a certain logical incoherence. We get along in ordinary speech because we do not push language to its limits, do not construct the pathological sentences that would reveal the contradictions, but they are there, waiting, and the liar paradox is one place where they break through into consciousness. This conclusion troubled many philosophers. It seemed to say that ordinary language, the tool we use for science, philosophy, literature, love, law, everything human, is fundamentally broken at its core. Moreover, the infinite hierarchy felt artificial when applied to natural language. We do not think of ourselves as shifting between infinitely many levels when we talk about truth. We use one concept, one word, applied freely wherever needed. Tarski's solution worked by fragmenting truth into infinitely many distinct predicates. It solved the technical problem but seemed to change the subject. There is also a deeper philosophical cost. If truth is always relative to a level in the hierarchy, if there is no single unified notion of truth but only truth in L, truth in the meta language of L, and so on, then what becomes of truth itself? We can say that snow is white is true in English, but we say this in some metal language. The hierarchy never grounds out in a final, absolute perspective from which we can speak the unqualified truth about truth. Tarski was aware of these limitations. He never claimed to have solved every puzzle about truth or to have given a complete account of how truth works in natural language. What he did was solve a precise technical problem: how to define truth for formalized languages without generating the liar paradox. In this, he succeeded completely. His theory remains the standard framework in mathematical logic and formal semantics. The liar, in Tarski's system, is diagnosed and dismissed. It is shown to be an ill-formed attempt to violate the level distinctions that truth requires. We can say why it fails. We can point to the exact rule it breaks. And yet, when you read the words "this sentence is false," they still seem to mean something. They still generate that familiar vertigo. Tarski told us the sentence is impossible, but the sentence does not feel impossible. It feels perfectly comprehensible and perfectly contradictory. Tarski's solution is elegant, but leaves many philosophers unsatisfied. It tells us the liar is impossible, but it does not feel like an explanation. In the late 20th century, new approaches emerged, attempting to let the liar exist and describe the strange logic that surrounds it. By 1975, the philosophical landscape had shifted. Mathematicians had learned to work around the liar paradox through careful restriction, and most had moved on to other problems. Tarski's hierarchy seemed to have settled the matter. Truth cannot be defined within its own language. The paradox attempts the impossible, case closed. But for philosophers concerned with natural language rather than formal systems, this felt less like a solution and more like an evasion. People actually use self-referential sentences. We say things like, "Everything I just told you is false," or "this very statement is unverifiable." These sentences exist in ordinary discourse. They cannot be dismissed as meaningless merely because they create trouble for our theories. A young philosopher at Princeton named Saul Kripke began asking a different kind of question. Instead of trying to eliminate the liar or prove it impossible, what if we tried to describe the actual semantic landscape in which such sentences appear? What if we mapped the territory where truth becomes strange rather than declaring that territory off limits? Kripke's approach began with the observation that not all sentences stand on equal footing. Some sentences are grounded in reality, The sentence "snow is white" refers outward to something in the world and gets its truth value from that external fact. Other sentences are grounded in already established truths. Either snow is white or grass is blue depends on the truth values of its components but causes no trouble. The liar sentence, however, floats free. It refers only to itself, trying to pull its own truth value up by its bootstraps. It is ungrounded, circling endlessly without ever touching solid semantic earth. Kripke proposed a construction that begins with the most basic grounded sentences and builds upward in stages. At the first stage, you have simple empirical claims about the world, sentences whose truth values are fixed by observation and fact. At the second stage, you add sentences about the truth of first stage sentences. At the third stage, sentences about the truth of second stage sentences, and so on. You continue this process through infinitely many stages, each one expanding the domain of sentences that have determinate truth values. Some sentences eventually become grounded at some finite stage. Others never achieve groundedness, no matter how far you climb. The liar is one of these permanently floating sentences. It never connects to the earth. But here is what makes Kripke's theory philosophically rich. He does not conclude that ungrounded sentences are meaningless. They exist. They have semantic content. They simply lack truth values. Kripke introduced the idea of gaps in the semantic landscape, places where the classical insistence that every sentence must be either true or false breaks down. The liar sentence is neither true nor false. It falls into a gap, and that gap is a genuine feature of how language works, not a defect to be eliminated. This was a radical shift in perspective. For 2,000 years, philosophers had treated the liar as a problem to be solved. Kripke suggested it might be a phenomenon to be described. The paradox does not reveal a flaw in language, but rather shows us something true about the structure of semantic evaluation. Some sentences simply do not connect to the world in the way that would give them classical truth values, and this is acceptable. We can build a sophisticated theory of truth that accommodates these gaps without collapsing into incoherence. Other philosophers went further. If we can tolerate gaps in truth values, why not tolerate overlaps? This question gave rise to paraconsistent logics, systems that allow contradictions to exist without causing the entire structure to explode. In classical logic, from a contradiction, anything follows. If you accept both P and not P, you can prove any statement whatsoever. This is called the principle of explosion, and it makes contradiction absolutely fatal to any logical system. But paraconsistent logicians asked whether this principle is really necessary. What if we built logics that could contain contradictions, quarantining them so they do not spread? These systems abandon explosion while keeping much of classical logic intact. You can have contradictory statements without being able to derive that the moon is made of cheese or that 2 + 2 = 17. The contradictions remain local, isolated, unable to contaminate unrelated inferences. In such a system, the liar sentence can be both true and false without destroying everything else. The paradox becomes not a catastrophe, but simply an unusual case, a region of semantic space with non-standard properties. This leads to an even more radical position called dialetheism, championed most prominently by the Australian philosopher Graham Priest. Dialetheism holds that some sentences are genuinely both true and false simultaneously. These are called true contradictions or dialethia. The liar sentence, according to Priest, is not meaningless, not gapped, not merely apparent. It actually is both true and false. When you say this sentence is false, you speak a truth because the sentence is indeed false, but you also speak a falsehood because the sentence is simultaneously true. The contradiction is real, and we should accept it. For many philosophers, this feels like surrender. 2,000 years of effort have been dedicated to showing that contradictions cannot exist in reality, that they represent failures of thought or language. Dialetheism asks us to abandon that commitment and acknowledge that our most fundamental logical intuitions might be wrong. Priest argues that this is not chaos but clarity. The liar has resisted every attempt at elimination precisely because it cannot be eliminated. It is a genuine feature of semantic reality. Fighting against it is like insisting that black holes cannot exist because they violate our intuitions about space and time. Sometimes reality is stranger than our theories and we must adjust. Not everyone finds this persuasive. Critics point out that accepting true contradictions may solve the liar, but at enormous cost. If some contradictions are acceptable, how do we decide which ones? What prevents us from accepting any convenient contradiction and calling it a dialetheia? Priest responds that we have criteria. True contradictions appear at the boundaries of semantic closure, in self-referential structures that create genuinely circular dependencies. Ordinary contradictions, like claiming the same object is both red and not red all over at the same time, remain impossible. The difference lies in whether the contradiction arises from the structure of reference itself or from incompatible claims about external reality. These debates continue. Contemporary philosophy of logic hosts a plurality of approaches to the liar, each with defenders and sophisticated formal implementations. Some follow Tarski in maintaining that natural language is simply inconsistent and cannot have a coherent truth predicate. Others adopt Kripke's partial predicates and truth-value gaps. Still others embrace paraconsistency or full dialetheism. There is no consensus, no settled solution, only a richer understanding of the options and their costs. What has changed is the willingness to live with the paradox rather than demanding its dissolution. The contemporary attitude reflects a kind of philosophical maturity, an acceptance that not all problems have solutions in the sense that mathematicians mean when they prove theorems. Some problems are permanent features of the conceptual landscape, positions where our intuitions pull in incompatible directions and no amount of analysis will make the tension disappear. The liar paradox may be one of these. This shift mirrors broader changes in how philosophy understands its own task. The 20th century began with enormous confidence that logic could solve ancient puzzles and place human knowledge on absolutely certain foundations. That dream, as we have seen, did not survive. Gödel showed that formal systems cannot capture all mathematical truth. Tarski showed that truth cannot be fully defined within a single language. Quine and others argued that the boundaries between logic, language, and empirical fact are far less clear than anyone hoped. Philosophy learned humility. The liar paradox played a central role in this education. A sentence that appears trivial on first encounter turns out to touch the deepest questions about meaning, reference, and the relationship between language and world. It forces us to ask what we mean by truth, whether truth is a property of sentences or something else entirely, how language manages to talk about itself, and whether consistency is negotiable. These questions do not have simple answers. Perhaps they do not have answers at all in the way we initially imagined. 2,000 years of wrestling with a single sentence has taught us that language is a far stranger instrument than common sense suggests. It can turn back on itself, create structures that have no clear analogue in the physical world, generate statements that seem to have meaning but resist evaluation. This does not make language broken. It makes language rich, complex, capable of more than simple reporting of facts. The liar exists because language has the power to reflect on itself, to make its own operations the subject of investigation. That power comes with risks, and the paradox is one of them. The lesson, in the end, may be about acceptance. Not every puzzle can be solved. Not every question has an answer that satisfies all our intuitions. Some features of reality, including semantic reality, are genuinely paradoxical, and our job is not to eliminate them, but to understand them as clearly as possible. The liar paradox remains just as strange now as when Eubulides first stated it in ancient Greece. We have better tools for analyzing it, more sophisticated theories surrounding it, deeper insight into its connections to other problems. But the paradox itself has not gone away. It waits in the structure of language, a permanent reminder that the world, including the world of meaning, is deeper and stranger than any system we build to contain it. This chapter concludes the journey, reflecting on what the enduring unsolvability of the liar tells us about truth, meaning, and the relationship between language and reality.